Okay. All right. Hello. Welcome. We're glad that you're able. The event is hosted by the Center for Information Technology and Public Life at the University of North Carolina as part of our Spring Speaker Series. I'm Catherine Peters, CITAP's Executive Director. Hello. Hello. What is not muted? We're glad that you're able. Yeah. It is hosted by the Center for Information Technology and Public Life at the University of North Carolina. Can't mute it. Yeah. There we go. Let's give this a second go. Everyone has heard the welcome, and those of us here in the room have now heard it twice. CITAP is dedicated to understanding the growing impact of the internet, social media, and other forms of digital information in the context of the people who design, use, and govern. We're especially interested in people, platforms, and power. Our research takes a holistic approach to studying technology, focused on how social inequality and power structures shape the use, deployment, and impact of technology. We're committed to equality and justice in our scholarship, teaching, and dissemination of research. And in that spirit, I'd like to take a moment to consider the legacy of colonization in our technology systems and society. Our center occupies ancestral land of many native peoples, including the Shakori, Eno, Tuscarora, and Lumbee, and remains home today to the Occaneechi Camps. The university was funded in its early years from the sale of lands home to the Cherokee and Chickasaw. I invite you, as you join us today, to join us also in acknowledging our shared responsibility to pursue reconciliation and justice. Today, we're honored to host Dr. Jonathan Ong, who will be discussing the politics and ethics of representing the peoples. After his talk, we'll hold a Q&A session. For those of you joining us remotely, you can submit questions via email to citap@unc.edu. That's CITAP@unc.edu. To introduce our speaker, I'll turn the metaphorical microphone over to my colleague, Dr. Shannon McGregor, assistant professor here at Hausman School of Journalism and Media, and a senior researcher at CITAP.
Thank you. So hi, IRL and online. I'm really pleased to welcome Dr. Jonathan Ong here today. Dr. Ong is an associate professor of global digital media at the University of Massachusetts Amherst and a researcher fellow at Harvard University's Shorenstein Center for Technology and Social Change Project. Also, please join me in a brief early clapping session to congratulate Dr. Ong, who was recently selected as one of 28 Andrew Carnegie Fellowship awardees for 2022-2023. Dr. Ong is a prolific scholar, the author of 2 books, dozens of peer-reviewed articles, and the editor of 5 special issues of journals, including a forthcoming one in the International Journal of Communication on the True Costs of Misinformation, Counting the Casualties of Fake News, and another forthcoming one in this journal, Social Media and Society, on disinformation for hire and click farming around the world. Outside of the academy, he is an engaged scholar, writing and appearing in outlets like the Columbia Journalism Review, CNN Philippines, and the London School of Economics' widely read blog, where he is also an alum. He's one of the leaders of the Newton Tech for Dev Network, which is a global consortium of scholars that aims to advance research on digital technologies in low and middle income countries. The network hosts innovation workshops, researcher exchange programs, and intersectoral dialogues between academia and government and humanitarian policymakers. Dr. Ong's recent work, which we are thrilled to hear more about today, builds from ethnographic studies to understand paid trolls and political public relations specialists. What are their work arrangements, their social identities, and their moral justifications for engaging in this work? This work has shaped campaign finance policy in Philippine elections, as well as social media platforms' content policies about inter-Asian racist speech. In an address last year to the Wilson Center on COVID-19, racism, and disinformation, Dr. Ong said, "We need to account for how hate speech and right-wing ideology might travel internationally through social media, but we also need sociological and historical perspectives. nuancing how racism and internalized racism are experienced by AAPI communities in our ethnic diversity, our socio-linguistic differences, and our class differences. And it's exactly this type of work and commitments to engage in impactful scholarship that, of course, we also value. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Ong to CITAP.
Shannon, for the very generous introduction. Thank you, Katie, for your hospitality. It's been a delight to also meet students who have here. Thank you for having me. Also, for those watching via live stream, thank you for joining this counter programming to President Obama's talk. I will also be sharing a reading list. So thank you for joining me. So my talk today retells of ethnographic encounters, risks, and opportunities of the storytelling that comes after, with people labeled as trolls, bad actors, and conspiracies on social media. So questions would include, how can we retell perpetrators' narratives and social positions without also condoning or platforming, apologizing for their actions? How can we make space for nuanced social analysis and at the same time channel energies toward active denunciation? So my talk will draw primarily from my research on the Philippines called Architects of Network Disinformation. And the general themes of this project are about complicity and ordinariness as qualities that define the everyday work in the digital underground for political meme operators, influencers, and political strategies. Listening to these workers, we hear a range of social positions. Some speak confidently, others playfully, many embarrassed and also guilty. How can their accounts, some told in earnest, and others bold if sincere, help inform our intervention? So I'll also preview recent research on network conspirituality, which I also love to get your feedback on. And this is ethnographic engagement with people in the astrology, tarot, and wellness spaces, the new age communities, with various degrees of proximity to conspiracy theory. So the question here would be, how can principles of care and patient attentiveness also help retell their story beyond mainstream caricatures of anti-vaxxers who intersect with woo-woo belief systems? So the social and intellectual exchange that I invite in this talk is reflexivity about the process of ethnographic storytelling, the challenges of using stories as tools for advocacy, and the communities and allyships that sustain critical and engaged work. So, next slide. Yes. Here it is, my disinfo study. So it is not quite a President Obama's reading list. It's super inspiring to me, all the folks that I cite here. I'm sure there's also a lot of overlaps with your own syllabus that you folks have written about and platformed out here at CITAP. With Robin Kaplan and colleagues' work against platform determinism, I'm really inspired by how they disrupt the idea of platforms as these giant monoliths, right? So for me, I'm guided with insights from their work. Like when I think about my own engagements with national level public policy officers, especially those who are working in very constrained political contexts and environments where the government is the bad actor. Like, should we engage with them? How can we guide them, right? And so those insights inform my own engagements with some of these actors. With Chris Anderson and Jason Cabañas, I've written about how, traditions of the ritual model of communication might still be important when we think about the fake news, not just as issues of false and true, right, but as stories. And I think it's important to be thinking about that. How to expose media's own predilections for newsworthy scandal, and that's what makes them susceptible to the attention hacking strategies of media manipulators in the foundational work of Alice Marwick and Becca Lewis, of course. How it's also important to set our targets on the big fish and how political elites find ways of maneuvering and evading accountability while other social media actors suffer the penalties, right? How can we assign accountability to those at the top in the work of Kate Starbird, Dan Kreese, and Shan Breger here? How to document social harms and center the perspectives of communities when developing policy and advocacy work. In Rachel and Madhavi's work, also the work that we do with Joe Donovan at the Shorenstein Center. How can we find best ways to document social harms and advocate support that's sincerely transformative and meaningful to communities? I think that's super challenging to think about. And my own specific take on this issue of social harms is how can we think about and examine the hierarchies of harms that also get sustained if we do not also interrogate the politics of knowledge production and the global donor funding structures that support them. So I also am inspired by Paula Chakravarty, Sri Rupa Roy's work, advancing a non-Western critique of mediated populism. Obviously, their critique is about how the field is overly fixated on social media's effects on elections, while ignoring the character of media systems in quote-unquote most of the world, and how we need more analysis of perhaps also media ideologies, including the developmentalist media ideology, where, in the words of Paula and Surupa, media institutions in the global south are positioned not as liberal watchdogs that check the power of the state and ensure the exercise of individual freedom, but rather as developmental guardians who check the unruly ignorance of the people and work with the state to advance a common project of it. So how can we think about the rise of new populist leaders alongside the rise of a new media elite? New plutocrats and crony capitalists who are players in new media fields where Modi, Erdogan, Duterte would find favor. Also, the work of Chinmayi Arun and Sahana Odupa examining governance, digital governance in global context. Okay, so for this slide, disinformation in the global south. Here I'm just mapping out this info in the global south, and I speak most directly about the Philippines, where I've done most of the research. My areas of expertise also includes Thailand and Indonesia, and I've authored a report comparing elections in these three Southeast Asian countries. So this is a snapshot that maps out general patterns, and I'm also curious for those of you who compare it in international work, how this might be applicable to your own situation. So the argument I put forward in this slide is that disinfo studies in the global south is in a problematic state. I couldn't quite figure out how to phrase it. Like, do they face roadblocks? Are they problematic or a little low vibe? But anyway, it's very painful to see how here, between illiberal states and pro-democracy civil society responses, the discourse about the fight against disinformation is almost indistinguishable. You would think both camps are ideologically opposed, but shared across both camps here, as you can see, is a simplification of a complex crisis to a hunt for online anonymous trolls, often associated with the lower classes of society, depicted as misbehaving or unruly. Both enact a moral politics where the eschatological language of good versus evil are used. Populist leaders would look at online trolls as bad citizens for being too vociferous in their criticism of the state. For civil society actors, online trolls are fake online actors disrupting norms of civility. And absent from both camps is structural critique of global techno-capital and how it burrows deep, interconnects with local histories of crony capitalism, media ownership. And that is the fertile ground in which disinformation innovations emerge, thrive, become profitable. So I'll start with discussion of illiberal states' response. And here I'm referring to a range of government systems from authoritarian to authoritarian leaning. Importantly, look at that range, but here is just a summary of trends that I observed. So many Southeast Asian countries have innovated various fake news laws. Sharon George, in journalism studies, calls a lot of these as legislative opportunism, where fake news moral panics are hijacked by the state to extend surveillance. While states themselves are guilty of using their own propaganda channels, online armies to stoke ethno-nationalist sentiments, anti-US sentiments, and discredit liberal mainstream. So if there are bipartisan legislation attempts, they're often disingenuous and misguided. So I've been part of like Senate hearings in the Philippines, for example, where older male politicians get to enact victimhood performances. Like each one is the biggest victim of fake news, and it's while ordinary citizens and their own experiences of disinformation are left out of those discussions. So the roots of the problem would be left unchecked if it's only the state's securitization agenda or individual politicians' ego that is being protected. So what about civil society response? So anti-disinformation efforts in the South are spearheaded by civil society organizations, so that include mainstream media, fact checkers, human rights groups. However, they arrive at similar troll hunting or unmasking approaches under different liberal principles and their own incentive structures, but find themselves in similar places. So I think it's important that more research should examine how global aid infrastructures have narrowly defined disinformation interventions in the South. So US aid, UK aid, Aus aid are main funders of media literacy and fact-check initiatives in many Southeast Asian countries. And the donor agenda here are often top-down. There's very minimal opportunity for bottom-up creativity, as well as intersectoral collaboration, right? Where journalists might work with academics. What happens here is that these existing aid infrastructures only foster intergroup competition, right? While extending colonial relationships of the power relationships of dependence. Human rights groups at the forefront of disinfo interventions are well-meaning actors, and I personally have collaborated with human rights groups in the Philippines and tried to find ways to advocate for the resources for the digital workers within human rights organizations. But they're also constrained in the kind of critique that they're able to advance and the kind of interventions that they're able to promote. In the words of Kate Nash, the human rights movement has grown to address state violence and persecution in a post-war order, but not the structural injustices of global capitalism. So it's no surprise that what would be easy and transportable and exportable, such as fact-checking interventions, are much more common in the global South. So, of course, the challenge faced by media institutions is how to sustain and fundraise for different kinds of community media efforts from foreign donors, while they also navigate chilling effects from government, chilling effects and censorship from the government. And my own advocacies when dealing with donors here is to try to compel them to diversify the kinds of partners that they work with, to also support non-traditional agents, non-traditional partners, rather than relying on usual suspects. Troll imaginaries. So in this slide, you have here some images. So again, the politicians' responses on the left, and I'm focused on the Philippines here. And here, civil society responses on the right. So the imaginary of the troll or bad actors on the left would be anonymous or pseudonymous social media accounts. Also activists expressing political dissent toward the government. So there's been efforts to pass legislation that will require social media platforms to reveal anonymous account operators, like who are the people behind me. Human rights groups have tried to critique that, and of course, critical academics would also think that. At the same time, activists are sometimes scapegoated by other kinds of legislation as well. So on the right, there's name calling and offensive humor when talking about trolls, specifically as Duterte supporters. So here, I'm not saying you're Duterte, but you're Duterte. What does that mean? So they're pejoratively called Duterte and pathologized as political retards who pin their hopes on a messianic leader, and they're depicted as fanatical devotees. So they're sometimes labeling those bloggers and influencers as fake news queens, or sometimes displays disinformation as a foreign influence operation from China. And here we need to think about how US donor funding sometimes is responsible or complicit in fear-mongering about how disinformation in the region, in the Philippines, in Southeast Asia, obviously all these countries with territorial disputes with China, and here Chinese government influence operations, which happen, but that becomes spotlighted and that becomes the priority agenda of a lot of research. In spite of overwhelming evidence that disinformation is a thriving domestic enterprise. So I'd like to also give an example of how journalists navigate tensions and challenges around this space, including through their own emotional testimonies. And I think Nobel Prize laureate Maria Ressa has been at the forefront in terms of advocating for support for journalists, not just in the Philippines, but in the global South, and the Western world as well. So here, and here's a quote that I can see and interpret her advocacy as one that strategically uses platform determinism, strategically outlines the role of platforms when it comes to being responsible for thriving disinformation. And I see it as a strategic performance that might mobilize disparate actors to fight identifiable villains. So if I might quote Maria Ressa, in countries like the Philippines, Indonesia, Myanmar, when you get your cell phone, Facebook is automatically at default. That is your internet because it's free. So what happened in 2016 after the propaganda machine is fully formed is that they can so easily manipulate the people who are on free basics because all they see is the headline and they can add anything. And when you click it, you have to pay. So Filipinos won't. They can't afford to. That then made it even easier to spread disinformation, forget it, to spread lies. Not just in the Philippines, in a lot of countries in Southeast Asia, a lot of countries in the global South, where the dangers are far greater than in the West, because in our countries, people are dying. So here, there's definitely activist justifications. I would interpret it as that, behind the use of platform determinism as a strategic mobilizing narrative. This storytelling earns global attention as to help draw resources to journalists and news outlets, and also shape global discourse around the capacity of journalists. I also would want to, I think it's okay to open space to talk about the risks as well that such advocacies and statements might pose. To me, it slots easily to the development of this media ideology that Chakrabarty has warned of, an ideology that positions the poor of the South as objects of development, to be weaned out of addictions or educated with the right ICT use. Obviously, the masses are long targets of voter education drives, media literacy campaigns, rather than agentic citizens who also make active compromises and choices. Paraphrasing Lily Kolyaraki, the scholar, who critiques also discourses of development, its use of reasonableness and pragmatism to inform policymaking might correct institutional practices without necessarily challenging the power relations of society. So it's against this backdrop that I try to think about what can ethnography contribute in trying to not overthrow, but to interrupt dominant imaginaries and think otherwise, think what other interventions are possible, right? And I think before we think about the level of interventions, it's also about the imagination and how we see the public, how we see the world and other citizens. So, so from the event, I think I said this over lunch, is anthropologist Tina Das, who specializes in social suffering, but also engages in issues of moral anthropology. An anthropologist who has done fieldwork in slum, and writes powerfully about how crisis works its way into the everyday. And her style of writing would actually contain the argument. Her book Life and Words is great. For those of you who write about deep stories, I think she has excellent discussions about rumor and how the power of rumor, especially in crisis contexts, are expressive of grievances, anxieties, and sometimes through metaphor are able to produce political critique of leaders and people around the village that they can't give a name to formally, but it's through metaphor and rumor that they're able to do that. And I think that's really great. So closer to home in media studies, obviously Laura Grindstaff, Vicky Mayer's work in media production studies are important inspirations. They have also done research on bad actors in the media industry. And I think what can disinformation studies learn from the research of casting agents of Jerry Springer in the work of Laura Grindstaff, who are racist and classist, right? Also the work of Vicky Mayer, my favorite paper of hers on the misogynist porn producers. How can we learn from that when retelling and producing more systemic critique of economic incentives, organizational work environments without knee-jerk judgment of individual personalities? So at the same time, ethnography is not one to shy away from normative judgment. For me, an ethnographic approach can actually advance nuanced questions of ethics and accountability. And for my Philippines research conducted with Jason Cabañas, the storytelling and also our advocacy and engagement strategy, policy engagement strategy, is to exert political pressure on those we consider the masterminds of this information campaign. So the advertising and public relations strategists who moonlight as political consultants during election season, and they hide in plain sight from within established creative industries. Okay, so this public report was published in 2018, and this was based on 12 months of research, architects of network disinformation, and available as a public report. So, and here we started with interviews with digital political campaigns, and started from there. asked them to introduce us to the staff. And people had worked for campaigns at the president level, but also down to local level politics. There's an element of digital ethnography here as well. So especially for some of the meme account operators we interviewed, we asked them, especially for those who had quit the campaign already, like, can you link us to your accounts? Can you show us what kinds of content they produce? So we're able to compare what they say and what they produce. And we had like a lot of discussions around anonymity and disidentified information here. And so in our work, especially in architects, we don't name anyone, and we were okay up to settle on that as an issue. So the idea of not platforming, especially political strategists, and not to draw more attention and popularity to them, right? That was the rationality that we followed. Also, principles of risky research, and we had to do a lot of IRB discussions as well. So in this publication, led to media engagements, Senate investigations, an official response from the presidential spokesperson who denied the existence of troll farms, obviously, and I think that's impact anyway, and also civil society collaboration. And so what did we find out? So we offered this definition of what network disinformation as the organized production of political deception that distributes labor to a hierarchy of digital workers with professional roots in advertising and PR. So we identified that political campaigners and consultants maintain corporate accounts and consult, but at the same time consult for politicians on the side. They would use industry metrics and their own corporate portfolio when it comes to pitching their services to politicians, and also to use technical and industry jargon to impress politicians, but also to minimize the actual impact of their work. So it introduces respectability, the kind of work that they do. A lot of this work we found were project-based and sideline jobs. So 3 months, 6 months job leading up to the elections. So nobody is a full-time troll in this case, right? So everyone had like very fancy titles of public relations specialist, consultant, content manager, community media manager. So nobody is hired as a troll. And therefore, this architecture enables a moral displacement. It's always somebody else who's doing the work. So when you talk to the paid worker, they would say, oh, we're not doing the misogyny, we're not doing the racist speech. It's an actual supporter. And then if you talk to the strategist, oh, I wasn't the one who signed up on that very misogynist meme that was truly horrible and slut shaming. There's always somebody else to blame. And then if you talk to the fake account operator, well, I'm just doing this from my monthly income, but it's my boss who asked me to do this. Unfortunately, so there's always somebody else, and we found that important to shade in our writing. So we always had to clarify with our colleagues that we were not being apologists when we discussed how labor exploitation and also structures of this privilege were key factors that impel influencers and precarious digital workers to seek this kind of shady side gig. And we were always trying to tell them and continue to tell them that their main targets of unmasking the trolls should not be the lowest level operator, but the big fish, right? The chief architects who hold advertising money. And we also see the constraints of journalists and news agencies, right? So these people who also hold corporate accounts could withhold advertising revenue from news agencies. And so that was a challenge that we also recognized and see where they're coming from. And they're focused on, okay, let's focus on the influencers. At least, they have less impact on our revenue and revenue stream. So that paper, that report maps out this whole hierarchy of different workers of the advertising and PR strategists whom we named as chief architects of disinformation, and they're the ones who interface with the political clients, and the clients will never get to meet or rarely get to meet influencers who are key opinion leaders, anonymous influencers, and also the community level fake account operators. We call this dotted line here the disinformation interface, which talks about the porous boundaries between those who are paid, those who are more voluntary. Because we were saying that many of these grassroots intermediaries, these political fan groups and volunteer groups, sometimes will be creating their own pages, their own memes, as kind of like a proof of concept, you know. So here I'm gonna make your hashtag trend. I'm gonna show you and impress you that I can do this, and then later on we get rewarded with the official paid gig. And so there's a lot of like movement here. So much of this research also explored the social positioning and moral justifications of different workers at different levels of the hierarchy. So by hearing from them and retell their own accounts of working here, we also understood more clearly who felt invincible and who had no fear of talking to an academic, and those who are like so scared that they we had to really promise them and assure them at all times that we were going to be, that their information will be kept anonymous. So for the digital strategist like Dom, who's very confident, she would say, maybe if I had this power 10 years ago, I would have fixed it, and I could join with you guys. But now I'm in my 40s, it's a good thing, I have a little maturity on how to use it. But what I'm really saying is we can fuck your digital life without even you knowing about it. And each like strategist had their own kind of persona that they were like huge fans of, like in pop culture. So for Dom, she saw herself as an Olivia Pope. For another PR strategist, she was Olenna Tyrell of Game of Thrones. Behind the scenes that nobody needs to know. So they had their own like imaginations of themselves. They saw themselves as disruptors. For the digital strategists, they also, and some of them had ran field campaigns. And so like your disinfo, it kind of failed it because your candidate didn't get elected. And they would say, oh, it's the fault of the mainstream media strategist who was still running the operation. So we were always peripheral, but had I been the one running the show, I would have won as the campaign. So things like that. For the fake account operator, they also had different kinds of explanations, and many of these lower level workers are young people fresh out of college from the top universities in Manila, and they were recruited into public relations firms, but without being told that they would handle political clients. So even at the level of recruitment, there was an element of deception as to what they were going to do. So here, Kevin, 25 years old, a graduate of one of the top universities, was so excited to land his job in a PR agency. His title was PR specialist. On the first day of his job, he found out that his client is the incumbent mayor of one of the largest cities of Metro Manila. And his first task is to create and maintain multiple fake profiles that would be seeding names in various local community pages on Facebook. And he likened his job to being a mistress, doing social media operations, while his colleagues who were handling the corporate accounts were more were the legal wife. So here, the whole time I felt like our team was the mistress, my other colleagues was the legal wife. And then the interview went on as to like, so what made you quit your job, right? And we found out that there's high turnover in the troll industry. So some of them 3 months and 4 months, and they couldn't get it. So I think that was the point for me. That my college professor, I saw him in the eye, was looking at me. Like he must be thinking, oh, he must be so disappointed with one of his students. I was a fresh grad, so it was impossible that he didn't recognize. So he was talking about being seen by his college professor while they were in a political sortie, like in one of the villages, but they were also doing like grassroots community kind of mobilization. So, and now I'll just also talk about outcomes of engaged research. And I think it's important to think of achievements and failures of this kind of storytelling, and not just the storytelling, but also the advocacy work that came out of it. And for the 2022 election cycle, what we see here as a modest achievement would be a narrative interruption. So now there's more deeper inquiries and journalistic investigations into the business of campaigns. Like how much are people making? Who are the other people behind the scenes? So there's more of a deconstruction of what it actually entails to run a campaign. So, and we see this as a modest achievement. I have to call out some mainstream media articles who still practice shoddy citation practices and end up platforming perpetrators. So sometimes rather than journalists citing the actual academic research, right, that exposed how it works, they would talk to the campaign strategists and platform them as experts, right? And I find it really, really problematic that so they turn to these people like in their talk shows or their journalistic pieces and not ask them about their responsibility or complicity, but to ask them as experts, yeah, please inform us about the whole industry. It's like, okay, there's something missing. So, and that needs to be called up, I think, and I think that's quite challenging as well. There's modest policy shifts at the government and platforms at the national level in terms of what kinds of issues will get taken down. I obviously welcome more global regional investigations of disinformation for hire or dark PR. Co-lead Lee Edwards at the LSE talks about dark PR. This info for hire, obviously Craig Silverman has written a lot of pieces around this. So I think that's great. And also an ongoing project to facilitate disgruntled creative worker collective. So there's a passion of mine. Like, what if we get people who had previously worked for campaigns and just to get them to talk about their work and how challenging it is or how they were exploited, you know. So we're experimenting with a podcast production company in the Philippines to look into this. And I see parallels here with the challenges that digital workers experience with the frontliners who are calling it out, who similarly experience challenges of working social media operations for human rights workers. And this report for the Shorenstein Center, some colleagues, was about how the digital workers in the human rights space feel like they're second-class citizens within their own space. And so, to me, the common thread here is worker advocacy and how to facilitate that. Okay, so we have time. Yes. Okay. So this is a very new research topic. I'm encouraged by my colleagues at the Shorenstein Center to do more research. My colleagues there have done excellent work exploring various corners of QAnon, and they were like, well, Jonathan, you're huge into crystals, you're huge into tarot. Please tell us about the psychic meetings who are talking about reptilian evil overlords and all the aliens who are part of the story. So I see people in the new age of spiritual space as really a convergence point of many anti-establishment belief systems, right? So many of them have legitimate reasons for critiquing mainstream science and medical establishments, how that's exclusionary, and so they advance their critique there. And then there's other people, and it's a very diverse community, who also look at and advance conspiracy theories, right? And I think it's important to think about the diversity within this space, trying to push back on some journalistic depictions of this community, and there's ways in which people who are in the woo-woo space all get lumped into, there's a natural affinity, for example, with far right and the new age. There's some people who write about that, so it's important to challenge that and interrupt some of the kind of storytelling, and also think about how within their own community, there's ways in which they police and monitor each other. And the interviews that I've done center the folks who do podcasts, YouTube live streams, and astrology forecasts. But what they do is to also call out the conspiracy and QAnon beliefs that are thriving in this community. Right? So I think it's important to look at and interrupt the caricatures and also disrupt those easy distinctions that are sometimes forced down into this group. I'm also happy to share tips and links to the very good astrologers for those of you who love compatibility readings. Yeah, and so sometimes I will after the interviews, I'll also get a reading from some of these folks. And so happy to talk about that. And so yeah, now key learnings. So for me, I'll just end with a slide that our imaginary of the problem shapes the range of possibilities for our actions. And I think if we simplify and caricature, that can lead to also superficial kinds of response. Engaged scholarship to me opens a conversation about diverse community fears and anxieties, but also hyper attuned to inequities of voice. I think the idea that people all perform victimhood performances, right, and think that they're all equivalent. Here's power structures that will make us attuned to those inequities when people enact these kinds of performances. And for Global South, I think we need to challenge also the usual genre of Global South tech stories and journalism that retell their victimhood narratives for Western shock or significance without meaningful local engagement. So I will end there and would love to feedback and questions.
Grab a sip of water. We have questions, obviously, in here, and then I'll hobble up here. Folks online, just as a reminder, you can email us at CITAP, CITAP @unc.edu. Awesome. That was amazing.
Thank you so much. I think my first question is, are you going to do a book on this? Because I would totally love to publish this as part of our series. I'd love to
Always hustling. Always hustling.
My more substantive question is, and this is really one of my own ignorance, can you say a little bit more about the institutional context within which both, you talk a lot about the liberal state responses to fake news, but I'm also wondering institutional, potentially advocacy that challenges that state. So, and how does that fit within these informational dynamics? So, because we talk so much in this country about relationships between two main political parties, but can you sort of sketch a little bit more what that civil society looks like? And what are the possibilities for opposition as it intersects with the informational dynamics that you're telling us?
Absolutely. So thanks. It's a generous question that enables me to go deeper into the context and histories, right, and the political context in the Philippines, where the Philippines, as not unique in itself, but with many countries in the global south, where political systems are not clearly demarcated around ideological difference. And a lot of Southeast Asian countries especially are personality driven rather than having distinct policy differences from one party to another. So I think that that's important to think about that. Democratic challenges here would be a competition among rival elite factions, right? And that therefore kind of enact a more elite democracy kind of context. And therefore, civil society responses would be supportive of liberal democracy principles as they are personalized to a specific group or party. And so, so at the same time that it is quite porous in terms of who gets to be part of which particular group. So political alliances kind of like move and shift according to who's the charismatic leaders. And so I think it's important to sketch that out. At the same time, like when I talk about civil society here, I'm talking about news agencies, human rights groups, also increasingly sometimes humanitarian agencies who are expanding their mandate to more disinformation kinds of intervention. So some of them are, like journalists are more traditionally oriented toward media literacy, while there's increasing space for people in other sectors to invest in anti-disinformation. Does that address your question? I feel like there's another layer.
No, it's super interesting. So, like, if I understand you correctly, if politics is less tied to a set of ideological interests or like racial and class interests, and more about various alignments and more fluidity around personality and charisma, that just like it makes the informational dynamics there so much just different, and I'm very intrigued by it. That helps me understand like conspirituality movements, for instance, because the ways that these things line up look different, very different than they would in the U.S. or the UK, for instance.
Yeah. So to me, that political history in the political system spotlights more the importance of political branding in that whole industry and enterprise. Insofar as their role becomes so much more important in terms of shaping public opinions. It just depends on which kind of family and elite group becomes the incumbent political party at that particular time. Thank you. Alice?
Thank you so much for this talk, Jonathan. It was so interesting. And one of the things you mentioned was that the solutions to this problem that are often made legible by like the funders, right, are media literacy and fact checking solutions. Now I have my own opinions about these as like solutions to the problem, but I was wondering if what your work has led you to believe about these particular set of solutions and their effectiveness in this particular context, since they are probably exported without a lot of contextualization, I would imagine.
Yes, so definitely the interventions industry, if you call it that, like in most Southeast Asian countries, are dominated by fact-checking initiatives, right? And I work with them, and I'm friendly with many fact-checkers. And to me, the problem of fact-checking, of course, like it catches this info once it's already out in the wild. And of course, the data and society idea of strategic silence needs to also inform a lot of what happens here in terms of, what happens when you end up also just popularizing influence. So you draw more followers or more revenue to some of bad. I think that discussion is starting to happen, and I think some journalists, fact-checker organizations are much more critical in mind when it comes to should we name them this time or not. So to me, my huge discomfort in some of the fact-checking is when there's the kind of shaming that happens, and often it comes with a very classist kind of baggage. right? As I discussed earlier about how it's often the trolls are kind of caricatured as coming from the low income communities, the masses who don't know any better, and it's often kind of like, why don't people trust us anymore, right? Yeah, and so to me, I said, well, you're yourself, right? And so those are my my challenges to the fact check community, and so media literacy as well. I think that's yeah, as an educator, of course, as a fellow educator, like I always see, especially in recent discussions in the Philippines, that the history teachers are being blamed. So it's like, well, you history teachers did not teach the younger generation about the histories of the Marcos family. They are leading the polls right now, right? And the horrors of the martial law era, of a period of dictatorship that where there's blatant corruption. Folks here might know about Imelda Marcos and her thousands of shoes. People might know less about the actual extrajudicial killings that happened during that time. And there's a way of blaming the history teachers, which I feel like that's probably not the whole story, right? So it's a challenge. So what frustrates me about the funders is that their way of doing things has remained the same. So it's about, okay, we're going to distribute our funds to the same people who have done the same things over the past years. And so the need to diversify the kinds of work that need to be done and to facilitate more cooperation rather than competition. And so that's the challenge that we face.
Yeah, this was awesome. Thank you so much. I have a million questions, but I'll start with one. It's really interesting that the like workflow, like the architecture, you know, of the troll industry. I thought was so interesting because it quite mirrors how like the presidential campaigns that I talked to in 2016 here in the US were like operating in terms of like, you know, I don't think they'd see themselves as like trolls necessarily, but in terms of thinking about, you know, having these digital influencers and then having like very strategic reach outs to quote unquote organic groups, so like these grassroots intermediaries, right? So that's just like fascinating. But I guess like to see that these parallels, you know what I mean? Like from a comparative sense, right? But I guess my question about this relates to, and sort of knowing this flow of it, right? I guess one of my questions is how well known to like journalists, you know what I mean, is this operation? Because I'm wondering, how did news organizations deal with these troll accounts when it came to reporting, right? In terms of like using, you know what I mean, these as representations of the public, or saying like, this is what people think. Like, was it critical or reflective, or was it sort of, you know what I mean, plugged in?
Yeah. So the mainstream of journalist depiction would kind of so the idea of the troll farm, right, and Global South and politics in the Philippines would associate the troll farms as operating from political strongholds of certain regions that might be supportive of their and certain candidates. Okay. So they was isolated, working in kind of call center operations, kind of like copy pasting certain themes depicted by the political patron. Right? So the idea of the role of the anonymous influencers came out organically through interviews, and it was one strategist who felt like so invincible. She was like, "Oh yeah, you can talk to all my new producers." Thank you. Yeah. And then I found out that it's people who operate like romantic love quotes accounts, and then like different versions. Like love quotes accounts sometimes are like very sexy kind of accounts as well, and then they have different personas. But they're the ones who make those narratives trend. And these people are just those who engage with them, right? And see those kinds of posts within existing community groups. So I think that was instructive. And so I think over time, now the hierarchy gets talked about more. PR strategists get talked about more and their role in complicity. But when they're invited to mainstream media spaces, they get interviewed as experts, and that's what I think is quite challenging, and what needs to be called out still. So I think that's.
Yeah, I guess too, just as like a follow-up, like in this sort of, I forget what you called it, like
The interface.
yeah, and the interface, when it does come to these like grassroots intermediaries or the public just like agreeing, right? And like, resharing it or a hashtag that isn't, seeded, right, by one of these like disinformative organizations, then does become trending within the quote unquote like organic public. Like, does that get reported upon? You know what I mean? Like by the press, you know what I mean? Is that part of it? And if so, do they situate it, journalists situate it within this infrastructure or not?
So the discourse then becomes, oh, they were brainwashed.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
So
That's interesting.
yeah, and so the whole idea of legitimizing the grievances and making space for that, right? I think needs to be part of the storytelling to me. And so when the public gets represented and discussed, like they're brainwashed by this. Yes.
So first, I want to say thank you for the presentation. It's fascinating. In a similar relationship between volunteers and paid, i.e. people would produce proof of concepts in either pages or hashtags to go viral. One of the things that I was kind of thinking of that is it implies a level of publicity or knowledge of the industry inside of the industry, i.e. for me to be a volunteer to see an opportunity and then be like, I want that job, so I'm going to create a proof of concept. How was that specific negotiation negotiated, right? Was it like I PO'd them, I was already kind of tangential to the industry, or it's like I just peeped that you were doing it and I wanted it?
Yeah, I think entry points are very diverse and unexpected. Some would try to find like a connection point. So if you're an influencer who wants to get into this, sometimes you might want to see like a fellow influencer who has a formal paid collaboration and try to enter through that. But other times it's the politician who reaches out down to the influencer who has created something viral and something super catchy. So and so like the storytelling here in terms of the different entry points into this info was so important for us to talk about the normalization kind of argument, right? Which isn't always the easiest to translate like as a story for journalists. Right? Like, it's the culture, it's so normalized. But for us, it just makes the problem even bigger, right? Like where does one begin and where does and how therefore should we find like different opportunities to intervene whole system, right? That's on the page. Is there another question? Okay.
For commentating and really interesting to watch something I personally have worked on political campaigns and how that compares across the barriers. So I have kind of two questions. My first is this seems in the way you kind of obviously I'm not a comparative of US politics, but how exportable do you feel these kind of mechanisms are outside of the Philippines or South Asian context, or how much are these? I feel like the narrative we get sold off the US is these coal farms are housed in these countries. This is happening in Russia, or it's being exported to the global South, and it's impacting our democracy and harming our democracy, which I feel like this is really helping complicate, first off, that narrative with like a global exploitative labor context, and then two, just thinking of how actually contextual a lot of this work probably has to be based on that protocol.
Yeah.
So I guess that's my first question, and then I maybe will take my second.
Okay. Yeah, so the question of exportability, so for me, like the story of Cambridge Analytica, what resonated with me as someone who's more interested in the work arrangements was the whole consultancy operations for it, how meetings with political clients happen and how their services are hyped and talked about. That to me, like, I see so many parallels in terms of political consultancies as a whole unregulated enterprise, and how when we think about how should we also include transparency and accountability mechanisms when it comes to political consultancies at large, but also perhaps political marketing, influencer marketing, and their own complicities to disinfo. So to me, that was the story, the part of the Cambridge Analytica story that resonated the most, more than the data extraction part of the story.
And that kind of, I think, actually feeds into my second question, which maybe is not as well formulated, but what do you see as the barriers to being a normatively good or bad activity? I think often, again, in the US, we characterize this as like dis or misinformation. But to Shannon's earlier point, a lot of political campaigns and work I've done in the past is advocating, like, there's no fact check necessarily on it, but we're advocating voter information, or you're providing information about a politician that's actually true. Or so I suppose is that part of the thing so contextual to the global South that it's hard to have that as we would define the West normatively good, or how are you as a scholar trying to interrogate where those barriers kind of crystallize?
Yeah. So and here as someone who does engage research, but when it comes to like legislation, right, that's not my area. For me, like I would like this discussion like in this info studies, especially when thinking about whole of society interventions and regulation, to include discussions about accountability of these political operators and political PR, where to me, to kind of always just focus on platform accountability and to blame Facebook for everything, ask them to focus on content takedowns rather than to creatively think about transparency and accountability mechanisms in terms of who are the people who are hired as consultants. How can we declare like advertising spends, influencer marketing spends? Is there like a way to track them more systematically, and that might inform regulators, because that matters when we think about fair and just elections, right? Like if one campaign is like overspending, right? Just because we're unable to track how many influencers were hired, and most of our efforts are still monitoring TV ads, radio ad spends. Right? So to me, that's the advocacy that I try to do when it comes to local level legislators. But I think we need more folks in the global north, as some of you have also done a lot of work around to help amplify some of those advocacies as well.
All right, I'll be greedy and ask another question. So I want to hear more about the networked conspirituality.
Okay.
Because I'm so I'm very into it. I'll have to get y'all in touch after, but one of my former students from the University of Utah, Mariah Wellman, who's starting at UIC in DC Public Policy's department as a professor in the fall, did her dissertation on wellness influencers and
yes,
interview them, and so not as much about the woo-woo stuff, of course that's in there, whether that's what she was looking for or not, but mostly around health and fitness, but then it turned into COVID right a lot too. But I think it's interesting, so in this project, it sounds like you're talking to people as well, right? Are you hearing yet moral justifications or justifications around their credibility or expertise, right, in this area? I'd just be really curious to hear about that part of it from both the influencer, but also it being in this expertise or credibility sort of space as well.
Yeah. Well, thanks for that question. So for me, it's interesting that the critique of mainstream science and the health establishment is shared. Also, the critique of mainstream media, like the anti-mainstream media narrative, is so common. Whoever you talk to, left or right, even the most progressive astrologers, and there's some super radical and progressive astrologers who do incredible chart readings that advise activists, for example, that this is the right time for you to do a street protest. Right? Like, amazing. But common to all of them is they don't trust mainstream. So they and some of their critique also of health and wellness and the scientific establishment is how it suppresses indigenous practice and indigenous health practices that have been delegitimized by mainstream science. So there's several like meme accounts, for example, that would point to look at this community, this tribe, for example, who have never experienced so and so virus because they never trusted, doctors. They never had vaccines. So it was interesting to see that it comes from different groups and not just people we associate, with far right conspirituality, that the distinctions of left and right don't neatly apply when it comes to where to track the roots of conspiritual beliefs are. So I think that that is important, for me to like sketch around and try to write around. So
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, it also reminds me of like the work in like political science around the anti-establishment beliefs, right? That it like goes beyond explaining a like left-right ideological paradigm, but what's shared is this distrust of establishments, right? Which in that case is talking about like political establishments, right? But in this case, it's talking about other institutions, right? And other establishments within society that are in the mainstream, right? Like public health or
Absolutely. So for these healers, and many self-identify as healers, whether you're an energy healer or astrologer or tarot reader, they obviously have a conception of the human body, not just in purely scientific, rationalist, materialist kind of conceptions, but as spiritual entities, and therefore blame scientific establishment for that kind of reductive depiction of it. So I think that's interesting to think about, in terms of how they describe different practices of healing.
The question I had was a pretty quick one, which is just, what is the network or institutional relationship of the conspirituality, right? Has it been used or harnessed by any larger group, right, for political purposes in a similar fashion otherwise, or is it more intrinsically grassroots?
Such a great question. What I'm finding so far, and it's still ongoing, very early research, done around 12 interviews myself. I also have a collaborator who's an anthropology grad from the University of Chicago, and he's an astrologer as well, so either to that community. But what we're seeing so far is more organic. So, and how especially the more extreme conspirituality expressions, also the more right-leaning belief systems come from unexpected. So I think I was telling Alice earlier on. So there's an astrologer based in Australia, like older white woman, suddenly like through performance weekly astrological forecast. So if you click YouTube, is always just the astrology of the week of April 20, right? So will not trip any moderate. But but she seems like super gentle, like super nice, always about healing and meditation. So I was like, I vibe with this woman. She's a Pisces, I'm a Pisces. But then suddenly started to like drop, first it was about anti-lockdown. I said, well, maybe she's just really frustrated. They've had it like really tough down there. And then suddenly anti-Joe Biden, and suddenly, oh, and then Trump said, okay, I can't with, yeah. And so like, to me, like, it's also shocking, like when I see myself like resonating with someone and then turns out to be, oh wow, they're, yeah, is my radar not working? But so far more organic, but I won't be, I'm sure there's so much more, I'm sure the analysis work might shape that, and how this is aligned very clearly with specific parties. There's some channels on YouTube, and some of those channels, like YouTube feeds, and they tend to be more male. I don't know whether that's indicative of a broader pattern, but I see some of those as much more political in terms of their kind of astrology, their kind of healing modality. There's more political commentary that tend to be much more aligned and very fixed with more friendly.
That makes sense. It's like the only historical corollary I was thinking of was like Savitri Devi back in like Nazi Germany and India. And then like, you know, the people of Corpus Ong.
I hear about that, yeah. Kali cycles, ascension.
Offer you one last major thank you.
Well,
Thank you so much.
And those of you in this room all, I think, are part of or at least close to the CITAP, but if anyone is following along and would like to get better touch, you can always find us on Twitter at UNC_CITAP. You can follow our newsletter at citap.substack.com. And this video will remain available on YouTube. Dr. Ong. Thanks so much.